your hand if you have a question, and one of the microphones will make its way to you. But first of all, I was hoping you could take us back to the very beginning of the project and talk a bit about how you first encountered Dr. Mireles and the autodefensas and Naylor in Arizona.
Sure. Can you guys hear me? Yes. Thank you again for coming. I first heard about the story. I was riding the subway in New York, and I read this Rolling Stone article titled Border Madness. And right when I read it, I knew this was a sort of topic that I wanted to dig into. It was about the Arizona side of the story, and I spent about 6 to 8 months talking to Naylor, gaining his trust, and then went there in June 2013 and filmed with him for the summer. And then my father actually sent me an article about 4 months later about the autodefensas, and just right when I read that article, I knew I wanted to create this parallel narrative of vigilantism on both sides of the border. I read a few more articles. I found a profile piece in the Washington Post about the doctor. I emailed the journalist, got on the phone with her a couple hours later, and I asked her, like, what was the doctor like? And she said, he's the single most interesting man I've ever been around. And as a filmmaker, you know, those are good words to hear. And so I got on the phone with him the next night, and 2 weeks later I was in Mexico filming. So I originally thought I was gonna be down there for, 1 to 2 weeks. I'd get enough footage to kind of create this juxtaposition, and 1 to 2 weeks turned into 9 months. So.
Hi. Well, first of all, congratulations. It was really, really beautiful. My question is, where did you feel the safest? Like, from what kind of the border, like Mexican border or American border? Because as a journalist, I would feel really, really scared. And I wanted to know, where did you feel the safest?
Right here. Or New York City, where I live.
That doesn't count.
I mean, the danger was obviously much greater in Mexico. There's some danger in Arizona. There's obviously the danger of them actually coming face to face with sort of armed cartel members, which are coming across the border, coming through that valley all the time. That sort of armed confrontation never happened in Arizona. Whereas in Mexico, the violence was visceral, was real. By the way, who in this room is, raise your hand if you're a journalist of some sort. Anyone reported in Mexico? Okay. So, just the minute I stepped foot in Michoacán, I knew, the danger was much greater. I'm not a war reporter. I've never been in any situation like this before. My last film was on healthcare in the U.S., which was, a different type of battle. But it was terrifying. I'd never been in a place where, gunfire was going off. I'd never been in a place where people were getting tortured. I had no idea sort of where this film would lead me. It was scary.
Thank you very much indeed for such a really powerful and thought-provoking presentation. I'm the former UK Customs Intelligence Analyst for transnational organised crime, and I am firmly of the belief that although the USA has certainly not solved the problem, if it's solvable at all, it's making a much better job of it than the European countries, who I don't think have fully grasped what is at stake here in their arm, as well as in the US and Mexican arms. But 2 quick questions. What has happened, if anything, to Smurf and El Gordo? And secondly, the weaponry that the autodefensas were using, I may have got it wrong. Did we see Kalashnikovs there? Where were they getting their weapons beforehand? Because it does suggest if everybody's got a plentiful supply of weapons and ammunition, that there is an awful lot of cross-agency and the point you made at the beginning about the fence, good and bad. It's very, very murky indeed.
Yeah. Especially on the Mexican side of the story, when I first went down there, I thought I was telling this very sort of simple hero-villain story of guys in white shirts fighting against guys in black hats, and over time, the lines between good and evil became ever more blurry, ever more complicated, and I almost became sort of obsessed, probably sickly so, to the chagrin of my parents and my girlfriend, to try to sort of understand this complexity, to try to understand, what was really happening, where this movement was going, where were the guns coming from, where were the trucks coming from, where were the bulletproof vests coming from, who's behind this, how is this working, how's it going to end, and, I felt like I couldn't stop until I got at least some of those answers. I'm not a weapons expert, so I can't answer what type of guns they were using, but the money for the auto defenses was coming from a variety of sources. It was coming from wealthy landowners in Michoacán who wanted to get rid of the Templars. The Templars for years had controlled every aspect of civic life. They taxed people from the local tortilla makers to multinational corporations and kidnapped or beheaded anyone that got in their way. And so, people with a vested interest, with a business interest in getting rid of them, were paying the auto defenses. There were other cartels that were providing guns, ammo, to clear out the Templars. There were people in the U.S. sending guns south for the auto defenses. There were literally like bake sales in California, fundraising for the auto defenses. So the money and the guns came from a variety of places. Sorry, Smurf. I have a short memory. I didn't answer the first part of the question. Where is Smurf and Gordo? I think the unfortunate thing with this story is obviously that the cycle has repeated itself. The violence has continued, the kidnappings have continued. The thing that everyone feared all along, both as filmmakers and journalists and as the auto defenses themselves, revenge and anarchy has played out. Just last week, we actually showed the film to the doctor's wife in Mexico City, but we haven't been able to get the whole family together. So last week we tried to get the whole family together, and there's a huge shootout in Michoacán. One of the auto defense leaders was assassinated. There's been, I think, 3 assassinations in the past month. So it's really sad. There's some people think that that the Templars are coming back. Others say that the Viagras, led by Gordo and his brothers, are the new game in town. I think it's hard to tell what's happening. Gordo is in hiding right now. We know where he is, but he's in hiding. He's being sort of tracked by the government, and we know generally where he is. I don't know exactly where he is. And his brother was just arrested. So I think the government is starting to realize that this experiment essentially of legalizing the formation of a new cartel didn't work.
Having been there in kind of the front lines, do you see any way at all to end the cycle? And anything, clearly the Mexican government's not really do much. From the U.S. side, is there anything at all that can be done, or is this just going to go on and on and on and on?
the hope question.
Yeah. Is there any?
I'm a eternal optimist. I believe in the goodness of humanity, but I don't see a lot of hope here, unfortunately. And I think one of the things that drove me initially to make this film, and that really struck me when I first stepped foot in Michoacán, was really the failure of government institutions. The failure of government institutions to provide basic safety and security for their citizens. You know, we've seen this story play out across the world today, throughout history. We'll continue to see it play out, where armed groups rise up, sometimes well-intentioned, for good intentions, sometimes not. But just a quick little aside is that first scene when the auto defenses take the town of Apo in the first act of the film, and the army comes in and surrounds them, and then the citizens surround the army. That beautiful woman who is screaming face to face with the army, both of her parents were killed by the cartel. Both of her brothers were killed by the cartel. And she was too scared to tell anyone. She was too scared that the police were the cartel, that the police were being paid by the cartel, that they would rat her out to the cartel. And so we were some of the first people that she ever told. So I think I'm meandering back to your question, but I think there's sort of two sides to this. One, there's really a failure of government institutions all across Mexico, especially at the local level. Direct collusion between cartel and local government. We see that all throughout Mexico. But obviously, the biggest thing is us, is Americans. We're funding this war, and we're through our consumption of drugs. And I think that's one of the things that I really hope that this film can do. Obviously, this is not a policy film. There's no talking heads, there's no voiceover, there's no government officials, there's no experts. But I hope one of my goals was to show viscerally, emotionally, this issue. Take it away from the headlines. This issue has really been glorified in TV shows and in movies, and I really wanted to show what was happening on the ground, how it was affecting everyday people, and then the response of everyday people rising up to fight back, and then the ramifications of what happens when they do so. And I think a lot of Americans don't really recognize that there's this war that's happening in the country just south of us, a war in the country that we share so much history with, a border with, a war in which 80,000 people have been killed, 20,000 plus people disappeared, gone, and largely due to our consumption of drugs. So even as we've legalized marijuana in the U.S., the amount of weed going across the border has gone down, and the amount of meth, cocaine, and heroin has gone up. So, the cartels will always find a way to make money, unless we have, meth labs in New York City, which I don't see happening anytime soon.
We have another question from the gentleman there.
First of all, Kevin, congratulations. It's in many ways an extraordinary film. It's extraordinarily brave. And for any of the filmmakers who are in this audience who have actually been in conflict, it's clear the danger you were in and the risks you took to tell the story. So really heartfelt congratulations. What was interesting to those of us who are a bit older than you, who have followed these things over a long time, is that in many ways the arc was so predictable. You look at the provisionals, you look at the UDA in Ireland, both of whom started off in vigilantes in many ways, and who got into drug running for all kinds of reasons, and then the sectarianism within the groups. I've made a film not as good as yours, but in Rio, and what struck me as the big difference, which I'd be interested to know, is that the Rio gangs who I was embedded with preyed on the own people. And in other words, they were selling domestically. And what seemed to be the difference with your lot is that they preyed on the people in terms of extortion and the rule of law and filling the vacuum that the Mexican government didn't provide, but they were in fact supplying across the border rather than supplying domestically to their own people. and I wondered if that was in fact a correct impression or simply something that was kind of skirted over in the film. I also really, as a filmmaker, was interested, if you don't mind me boring, or if this lot don't mind me boring, asking you some of the technicalities, actually how you made the film. You know, not how much it costs, which is always the question that people get, but actually to get this thing funded, made, and distributed, which had probably less than 5 minutes of English in it, in an American market and indeed here, is a major feat for which you should also be congratulated. But my question then twofold. One, do they prey domestically by selling domestically, or is it all going across the border? And secondly, how did you actually make it?
And just the second question, more from a sort of producing point of view or a technical point of view?
Yeah, what were you shooting on?
So the first question, there's sort of an unwritten rule. Again, I'm not an expert on Mexican policy or drug policy or border issues per se. You know, I really, with this film, wanted to. My last film, I did that. I spent 8 months researching before I even turned on the camera. This film, I just jumped headfirst, for better for worse, into it. I did some research. Obviously, I read a lot, but so I can speak to what I saw in Michoacán and what I understand about Michoacán and how the Knights Templar operate. They had this sort of unwritten rule of not selling to people in Michoacán. They actually entered Michoacán as a vigilante group themselves. You know, they entered to provide safety from this corrupt government. Their precursor to the Knights Templar was La Familia Michoacana, who they themselves entered the scene quite dramatically by rolling 7 severed heads onto a dance floor in Uruapan, with a note saying, "We're here to provide safety for the people of Michoacán." So, you know, obviously this is a very cyclical problem, but in terms of actually answering your question, they really try to actually police not selling it to the people of Michoacán, and really are sort of proud of poisoning us gringos. It's a hard, you know, if you have a specific question, I shot it on the Canon C300. Had a very small crew, 2 to 4 people. I shot.
How the fuck did you keep it in focus?
You know, I shot much of the film myself. Most of the verite I shot myself. All the sort of shootout, run and gun stuff I shot. You know, that first shootout. I'd never been in a situation like that before. I didn't know how to use a gun. I had no experience covering a war, but I knew how to film, and so I really just sort of focused on the craft of filmmaking. I focused on focusing. I focused on framing, exposing, making sure the record button was on, which I checked numerous times. And actually, that night when I got home, there was some sort of electrical glitch with the camera, and I was playing the dailies on the camera, and the entire shootout was not there. And I literally almost had a heart attack, and I couldn't believe it. And then I changed batteries, and it was there. But in that scene, you know, so much of the covering, you know, whoever's been in situations like this before, you know, so much of it is luck. We had been shooting in Michoacán for 3 weeks. We were waiting for 2 things. We were waiting for the doctor to be able to film the doctor in a safe house, where after the plane crash, and that took a long time. That took about 2 weeks for us to get in there. And then we're waiting for them to take this town of Los Reyes, which was a really big town in Michoacán, and we thought there might be some conflict. So once it took about 3 weeks of basically shooting 18 to 20 hours a day, and my crew was just exhausted, and they, you know, were basically like, we gotta go home. Like, we're done for now. And so we went to the airport and to fly back, and then my local crew to go home. Again, like two to 4 of us at a given time. And I put my bag on the scale and was ready to go. And then for some reason, I just had this feeling, and I took the bag off, and I called my fixer, and I said, you know, let's go back in there. And it was that afternoon that shootout happened. So, you know, so much of this stuff is luck and being in the right place at the right time.
Okay, another question here at the front.
I'm curious about access, because I mean some of them are setup shots when you're just talking and it's clear that you're kind of speaking to somebody about their life experience, but a couple of the shots, it's not clear that they even know that you're filming, or it seems pretty clear that they don't know that you're filming, and I mean, is somebody still wearing a mic? Like, how are you getting that? And what was their reaction when they found out that you'd gotten that on camera?
So the question was about access, and then the sort of part B of the question was, could everyone hear the question? Sorry, you have a mic. I'm so used to, sorry. I think there's several parts to the access that I was able to get. I think for one, there's a lot of journalists covering the story of the auto defenses, and they would often sort of parachute in, parachute out for 2 or 3 days. And I think it's a statement of a lot of things, but I think especially of the shrinking budgets of investigative journalism. We've seen that happen all across the world. Foreign bureaus shutting down, and so a lot of these news outlets were only able to be there for 2 or 3 days, and it's virtually impossible to tell a story this complicated in that amount of time. There's no way I could do it, that's for sure. And so I had the benefit of being able to be there for almost 9 months, and developing character arcs and storylines, and developing deep relationships with people on all different sides, from Gordo to the doctor to Papa Smurf. We spent a ton of time with these people, and develop a rapport. And then I think that the second part of it was that they were risking their lives and dying, fighting for what they believed in, and we were tagging along with them. And so I think there's a level of respect that came with that. That scene in the third act when things are starting to sort of unravel to auto defense us, and I'm in the car with them and then start getting shot at, and then sort of fall out of the car, and then it leads to that witch hunt through town, which leads to the father getting extracted from the family. That scene only happened from 8 months of sort of relationship building, and I was with Auto Defenses. 2 of their members had been assassinated the day before on mopeds. The tension levels were extraordinarily high, and suddenly they started jamming magazines into their guns and throwing their flak jackets on. And I asked them, hey, what are you guys doing? And I actually barely speak Spanish. I can get to the bathroom and order food pretty well, but so I asked them where are you guys going? And they said, oh, we're gonna go get some Starbucks. And I said, I'll go get some coffee with you guys. And that led to that whole scene. But if I had just sort of walked up and said, hey, I'm a gringo, can I film you for a day? There's no way that would have happened, or they would have let me into that car, or any of that stuff would have happened. As far as the sort of hidden mic stuff, there's 2 specific scenes I think they're referring to. One, when the auto defenses were breaking down and the camera was on the ground. That scene, I fought to get into that room. I used every sort of mental jiu-jitsu that I could muster, and I failed. And so my last resort was to put a microphone in the room. And so we did that. And I don't think they didn't want us in the room because they didn't want it recorded. I think they generally knew that this was going to be the end. And so they wanted to be able to sort of voice their different viewpoints without me being in the room. And so sort of morally and ethically, I felt that it was okay to use that. No one's voice besides the doctor was recognizable. And as far as the cheating or the sex scene or whatever you want to call it at the end, I'd spent 9 months with the doctor, and every day we woke up and we put this on him, and every night when we went to bed we took this off of him, and it was the same drill. And he knew how it worked. He's a quite intelligent man, and wherever the receiver is, goes on his belt, which is quite close to his private parts. So it would be impossible for him not to know that we were recording. And he led me to that house. It's not like we snuck behind him and were like, oh, he's having an affair, let's film him. I mean, we were with him as he was going to hiding, and it was his decision to go do this pit stop on his way. So, I think he was very well aware. And, I think the next question is why? Why would he want us to show that? And I think I have many theories. I think one is bravado. Two is, I think he very much viewed himself as a revolutionary hero in Mexico, as do many. And I think he felt confident in showing both his strengths and his weaknesses.
Okay.
The doctor is still in jail. There's been no due process, no trial. His family and his supporters, as we say at the end of the film, believe he's in jail, as do I, that purely to silence him. And as long as they don't want to hear from him, he'll remain in jail. Could be a day, could be a week, could be a year, could be 10 years. We don't know. Unfortunately, he's been unable to dig a tunnel out. But
Okay, we just have time for a couple more questions. I know there's one in the back and then one behind you, so let's take those two.
For the movie, I think it was a brilliant a piece that you made. As a Mexican, I'm very interested, obviously, in how you portray my country, and I think it's very accurate. I'm hearing from you what you're saying and your impressions, your views. I think, and I appreciate those. I think they're very accurate. Not so happy about the American vigilante though, because I think that he has a different agenda. It's more the immigrants than really fighting the cartels. Obviously, they cannot beat the cartels. They know that. But that said, and that aside, given that you were interacting with them for so long with in Michoacán with the autodefensas, I wanted to ask you, was there some critical point in which this thing fell apart, and was it because of the doctor? Was it because of the division? Was it because of betrayals or infiltrations? In addition to that question, would you think that the autodefensas can actually succeed? Is there a way that they can succeed if that inflection point hadn't happened, or for whatever factor it broke apart?
That they could have succeeded?
Yeah.
I think the beginning of the end is when the doctor got in the plane crash. And I was very lucky. If it wasn't my father's 70th birthday, I would have been on that plane with them. And the pilot died, the co-pilot died. His girlfriend was actually on the plane as well. She was badly injured, as obviously he almost died. He was very close to death. So I think that was really the beginning of the end of the autodefensas. With him on the sidelines, regardless of your view on him, he was a almost sort of messianic leader that held this movement together in many ways. And with him on the sideline, there was this fight for power within the autodefensas, and then the government also saw it as this extraordinary opportunity to begin to infiltrate the autodefensas, to begin to exert their influence, to begin to try to legalize them. And so I think that was really the beginning of the end. And there's a second part to your question that I'm forgetting.
Would the autodefensas have succeeded if that hadn't happened?
I think that's one of the questions that I always every single night for the past basically 3 years I think about, I thought about. There's many beers and tacos over this. First of all, what would I do? What would you do if your brother was hanging from a bridge, or your sister was raped? Would you take up arms? Would I take up arms? Is that right? Is that just? is vigilantism sustainable? And I think the film hopefully is an answer to that question. I mean, I don't think it ever is sustainable. I think there's no end game. Even as they were sort of plowing through Michoacán and cleaning out these towns, they weren't a formalized institution, and there's no the government essentially was allowing them to do this because they were doing their dirty work. They were doing what the government had failed to do for almost a decade. Michoacán was sort of a flashpoint. It's where Calderon first sent people, troops in when the war on cartels started in 2007. So the auto defenses were successfully doing what the government failed to do, and so they allowed them to keep doing it until they grew too large. And at one point, they were 20,000 strong, 20,000 armed men and women with assault rifles, being the judge and the jury. And I think it was inevitable at some point that it would crumble. It just was a matter of when and how and with whom.
I'm afraid we just have time for one last very quick question from the gentleman in the back.
Hi, Ross Cullen, a reporter and blogger. Two quick ones. First of all, Matthew, it's really intense. It's a powerful film. It's really good. Did you face any obstacles at all or roadblocks that you kind of came across just from the authority side, federal police, government, Navy? What were your dealings, if any, with them? And secondly, did you have a planned trajectory? You said you just kind of grabbed a bag, went down there to Michoacán. You built up a relationship with Naylor on the other side of the border. Did you want to split it at all, kind of 50-50, 60-40? Did you have that cyclical end back with the meth, back with the barrels of acid in mind? So that's kind of the second question.
I have a terrible memory. The first part.
Just the federal police, government, Navy, any of that.
Right. There's numerous times when the federal police, when the auto defenses threatened me, surrounded me, tried to take my camera away from me, intimidated me. But luckily, nothing ever happened. There's a quite comical moment where the president's attaché, the Commissioner Castillo, who we hear speaking about cycles in the third act, asked me to lunch, and I agreed. And it was quite clear that they, first of all, that the room was bugged, and second of all, that they were like, oh, we don't know much about what's happening with the auto defenses. Like, can you tell us what's happening? And I was like, I'm cool, thanks. But and then the second half of what they want to do is like, this is the official story that you should be telling, and I just kind of nodded my head. And then at the end of filming, we received somewhere between a threat and a warning saying that they are to watch my back, and that they're tracking my phone and my email. Whether that was a valid threat or sort of a hollow threat, we don't know, but we took it seriously. And in terms of the meth, I fought really hard to get that scene and failed for a long time. Meth was the lifeblood of the cartel. It was most of the meth that we consume in the U.S. comes from Mexico, much of that from Michoacán, and it's what the Templars are known for is their meth. And so from day one, I'd constantly ask somebody, do you know somebody who's connected? And we would do that. My crew, we would constantly, every shoot, ask. And after about 4 or 5 months, kind of gave up on it. And then it wasn't until our second to last shoot that we got this call saying, be in this town square at 6 p.m. and you're in. And it was both exciting and terrifying. And we drove to the town square, and a group of masked men met us there. and then they led us through these towns and smaller towns and fields and smaller fields, and then they stopped, and they said that they're there to provide protection, and then another car sort of slowly drove at us and led us into the forest. And I dreamed of shooting this scene for so long. I've never seen Breaking Bad, but I'd always imagined this sort of like halogen lit trailer. And I get out there and it's this deep dark forest and the sun is dropping beneath the mountains, and I don't shoot with lights. And so that's a problem because I couldn't see anything. And I just was like, I cannot believe I fought for 9 months to be here and I literally can't film anything because I can't see anything. And then the head chef starts showing me around the lab with this little flashlight. And it's with that little flashlight that I lit the scene. And that night, he said, you know, you're welcome back anytime. And so we made a date to come back the next night. And the next night, we showed up, because meth is cooked over a period of days. It takes about a week to cook a batch of meth. And so I really wanted to show the process. And so I really wanted to get back in there. And how much time, this is I'll tell a very quick story. And so we showed up the next night, waited out 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. They didn't show up. And then they texted the next morning saying, oh, so sorry, like something came up. Made a date the next night to show up. 3 nights, they blew us off. And then it was on the fourth day, it was our what I thought was our last day in Mexico. And I turned to my fixture and I said, you know, we know where the lab is. Let's drive in. And we sort of consulted other journalists and sort of agreed that if we did it during the day, it would be somewhat safe. And so we drove, and we were sort of guessing like left, right, and then we could start to smell the meth. And we knew we were in the right place. And we got actually about 200 yards away from the meth lab. And then this car started driving at us, and they drove up right next to us and rolled down their tinted window. And they said, what are you guys doing here? And we said, oh, you know, we were here filming a couple days ago, like we're back to film. And they said, I think you should go the other way. I think you should turn around and follow us out. And so we drove back out to the highway, and another car drove up, and they started interrogating us, asking us the same questions. Several cars came and went. And then one car finally told us to go to this pool hall. And this pool hall was where all the meth cookers hung out. And it was the most cinematic scene I'd ever been in my whole career. And all I wanted to do was bring out my camera and film it. But I knew, you know, they're smoking weed, like it's just like smoke billowing and these big sort of bulky men with guns. It was just like a really dramatic scene. But I knew if I brought my camera out, it would not only be dangerous, but it would probably inhibit my ability to get back into the lab. And so I started talking to some of the guys, and one guy spoke English quite well. And he started telling me about the connections between the autodefensas and the meth cookers and the government. And again, I was like, fuck, you know, I have to film this. But I knew that if I brought the camera out, I wouldn't get back in. So I didn't, and we eventually got back into the lab that night, and I got the shots that I needed to show the process. And for the next 2 weeks, I was just hating myself for not recording that guy. And then we ended up coming back to Mexico one last time. We were on the side of the highway, and I ran into that guy, and I said, would you be willing to go on camera? And he said yes, and he's the final guy at the end of the film with the government uniform on who reveals everything. And so for me as a journalist and as a filmmaker, it's probably the biggest lesson I've ever learned, that sometimes it's better to listen and not to film. And yeah, so anyway, thank you guys so much.
Yeah.
I just want to say, again, it's such a huge honor to be here at the Frontline Club, and thank you guys for coming. The film is opening in theaters all throughout the UK. Today it's in 27 theaters across the UK, so if you tweet, if you Facebook, even if you hated the film, just tell your friends about it. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you.